Hey there, wonderful viewers. If you're enjoying my content, please take a second to hit that like button. It really helps the YouTube algorithm show my videos to more people. Don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. Now grab your favorite drink, sit back, relax, and let's dive into today's story. I promise it'll be worth your time. I've spent most of my life in this town where the population sign reads just over 200. Though I'm convinced we might be down to fewer folks some days. You'd think it'd be peaceful. No traffic jams, no neon lights, and nothing but desert and mountains stretching out in all directions. And sure, it has its moments. At sunrise, you can feel like you're the only person left on Earth in a strangely comforting way. But once you realize how alone you truly are, that comfort can twist into something else entirely. My name is Michael Winters. I'm 32 now, but the events I'm about to share began when I was 15. Back then, I lived with my mom, older sister Jenna, and younger brother Sam in a weathered ranch house that sat on 5 acres of dusty land at the outer edge of Hollow Springs. The name always struck me as ironic. There hadn't been actual springs here for decades. Just cracked earth, sparse vegetation, and endless sky. Our nearest neighbors lived 2 miles down the road, and the town's single general store was a 20-minute drive away. Dad had left when Sam was just a baby, heading for the city with promises to send for us once he got settled. Those promises dried up faster than rain on hot asphalt. Mom worked double shifts at the regional hospital an hour away, which meant we were often left to our own devices. In a place with nothing to do, we created our own entertainment. Sometimes that meant trouble. For years, my siblings and I kept ourselves entertained by exploring massive gravel pits on the outskirts of our property. We called it our secret base, though there was nothing secret about it. It was just a big, dusty area filled with holes, a few rocks, and rusted-out signs warning people to keep out. Naturally, that made it even more exciting for us. We'd play survival games, pretend we were lost in some epic wilderness. It was the kind of place that felt exhilarating in broad daylight. Yet at the same time, it was always unnervingly quiet back there. The summer before I started high school was particularly hot. The air shimmered above the ground and the cicadas droned in constant waves. That was the summer when everything changed. Let's go further today, Jenna suggested one afternoon in July. At 17, she was our self-appointed leader, always pushing boundaries. Sam, barely 13 and still growing into his gangly limbs, looked hesitant. Mom said not to go past the old truck frame. Mom's not home, Jenna countered, already striding forward. I fell into step beside Sam. It'll be fine, I assured him, though I felt a strange reluctance myself. There was something about the deeper recesses of the pits that had always made me uneasy. All 3 of us decided to see how far we could go into the pit before freaking ourselves out. We trudged deeper than usual, ignoring the nagging sense that we were treading on ground nobody else bothered with. The silence grew more intense, like the surrounding desert wanted us to know it was paying attention. Then we saw it. A teepee. Someone had taken thick logs, freshly cut, judging by the pale wood, and arranged them into a surprisingly well-built structure. But there are no real trees to speak of in that area. Just dusty shrubs and the occasional scrawny bush. The 3 of us stood there gaping at this weird teepee that had no business existing out in the gravel pits. For a second, I toyed with the idea of going closer, but I couldn't bring myself to move. I saw that same hesitation in my siblings' eyes. So we backed away, acting tough and casual on the outside, but feeling pretty rattled under the surface. We should tell Mom, Sam whispered once we were a safe distance away. Jenna shook her head. She'll just say we shouldn't be out here in the first place. I stayed quiet, my mind racing. Who would build something like that out here, and why? The questions followed me home like an unwelcome shadow. For 3 nights after discovering the teepee, I barely slept. My room faced the direction of the gravel pits, and I kept imagining I could see movement out there in the darkness, shadows shifting against shadows. Each time I closed my eyes, I pictured the teepee standing there waiting, as if it had been built specifically for us to find. On the 4th day, I woke to find Jenna standing at the foot of my bed. Sam wants to go back, she said without preamble. I sat up, rubbing sleep from my eyes. Are you serious? He says he dreamed about it. Says we need to see if it's still there. I wanted to refuse, but curiosity gnawed at me too. What if it was gone? What if it had never been there at all? A few hours later, after a breakfast none of us really ate, we headed back to the pits. The sun beat down mercilessly, but I felt cold inside. We took a different route this time, circling around rather than approaching head-on. "There," Sam pointed, his voice barely audible. We inched around a bend in the pit, and that's when we noticed a dark shape spread out on the ground in front of the teepee's entrance. It turned out to be a raven split straight down the middle. The wings had been stretched out and there was zero blood anywhere. It was as if someone had dissected the creature in the cleanest, most precise way possible. One of my siblings let out a muffled gasp, and I remember wanting to say something comforting, but my throat refused to cooperate. Without another word, we scurried home, each of us pretending we weren't absolutely disturbed by what we'd seen. That evening, I convinced Mom to drive us back. Some part of me hoping we'd simply overreacted, but the teepee was gone. Not a single branch remained, as if it had never been there. My mom shot us a skeptical look, which just made it all more unsettling. "Are you kids sure you weren't just playing pretend?" she asked, exhaustion evident in her voice after her 12-hour shift. "It was right here," Sam insisted, his voice cracking. "And there was a bird." "Let's go home," I interrupted, suddenly not wanting Mom to know about the raven. It felt like a secret, something not meant for adult eyes. We were left with the memory of that bird, and the eerie feeling that whoever built the teepee didn't want us bringing any outsiders around. After that, I started noticing oddities wherever I went. A patch of footprints leading nowhere, a hush falling over the yard at twilight, or the way the desert seemed to stare back whenever I glanced at the horizon. I liked to act like it was no big deal, but deep down, part of me dreaded that I'd stumble onto another scene like the one at the gravel pit, and next time there might not be an exit route so conveniently open. August dragged on, bringing with it an oppressive heat that left us lethargic during the day and restless at night. Our air conditioning unit struggled and eventually gave up altogether, forcing us to sleep with windows open despite my growing unease about what might be lurking outside. I've always loved the night sky out here. It's colossal and clear, like a dome of scattered diamonds, and if I'm not too distracted by everything that comes with living in the middle of nowhere, I might even find it peaceful. Sometimes I'd hop into the bed of our pickup, lie back with a jacket tucked under my head and watch shooting stars streak overhead. One particular night, unable to sleep in my stifling room, I slipped outside and climbed into the truck bed. The distant mooing of cattle and shouts of farmhands from the Henderson place a few miles away became a nightly soundtrack, until something changed. That evening, the cows started getting rowdy at the usual hour, but over the course of a few minutes there was a shift in tone. One particular sound began rising above the others, a sound that wasn't quite right. I sat up, straining to hear. One particular cow began making sounds that were too human. The noise droned on, filling the darkness in a way that felt close, even though the feedlot was a decent stretch away. The cries grew louder, or at least more focused, until they were impossible to block out. My brain kept insisting there had to be a logical explanation. A herd animal or a weird echo, but my instincts refused to settle down. I abandoned my stargazing and darted into the house, my mind swirling with thoughts I could barely process. The next morning, I asked Mom if she'd heard anything strange. "Just the usual," she replied, pouring coffee into her travel mug. "Cows get noisy sometimes. You know that." But I knew what I'd heard wasn't usual. It was as if something was using the cow to speak, or worse, trying to mimic a cow and failing. That night I took Mom's ancient binoculars and aimed them toward the Henderson farm. Through the grainy lenses, I could make out the shapes of cattle moving sluggishly in their pen. Nothing seemed out of place, yet I couldn't shake the feeling that I was missing something important, something that was hiding in plain sight. I began keeping a journal of sounds. Normal ones, the distant highway traffic, coyotes yipping, the occasional plane overhead, and the abnormal, that almost human mooing, strange rhythmic thumps that seemed to come from the direction of the gravel pits, and worst of all, the silences, profound and absolute, that would descend without warning and last exactly 12 minutes. I timed them. By the time school started in September, I had filled half the journal. I didn't show it to anyone, not even Jenna or Sam. Some irrational part of me feared that acknowledging these oddities would somehow make them more real, more dangerous. What I didn't know then was that the sounds were just the beginning. For my 16th birthday in October, Mom surprised me with a dog, a sturdy brown mutt with floppy ears and intelligent eyes. I named him Toad, after a character in a book I'd read years ago. He was meant to be a companion, someone to keep me company during the long hours when everyone else was away. He became much more than that. From the first night Toad spent in our home, his behavior suggested he sensed things I couldn't. He would stand at windows, hackles raised, staring into empty darkness. He refused to approach the side of the yard that faced the gravel pits. And most telling of all, he would wake me with urgent whines precisely during those strange silences I'd documented. "Dogs just do weird things sometimes," Mom said when I mentioned it. She was working even longer hours now, picking up extra shifts to cover Sam's dental work. The exhaustion had etched permanent lines around her eyes. But Toad's behavior wasn't random. It was responsive. I became convinced he was reacting to something real, something that was watching us. Weeks later, I joined my family on our annual camping trip up in the mountains. We found an area surrounded by rugged trails and dense woods, a perfect place to turn off the rest of the world. Toad, my loyal companion, came along for the ride. After we'd finished setting up tents and everyone had started gathering brush for a campfire, I decided to scout ahead for bigger logs. Toad trotted at my side, sniffing the ground. I wandered around a bend and soon I couldn't hear my family's chatter. The noise from our campsite vanished behind me, and that's when a strange tugging sensation drew my attention deeper into the forest. It wasn't a physical force, but it was persuasive, like a whisper in my ear encouraging me to step off the trail. The notion felt ridiculous, yet it was nearly overwhelming. I found myself veering off the path, drawn toward a dense thicket of trees that seemed darker than the surrounding forest. Each step I took felt both wrong and inevitable, as if I were being pulled by an invisible thread. If Toad hadn't pulled back on his leash right then, I might have followed that urge blindly. With one sharp yank, he snapped me back to awareness. I spun around and hurried back to my parents and siblings, acting like I'd just been off daydreaming. No way was I about to tell them what nearly happened. The same tension clung to me for the rest of the trip. I tried to sleep in the tent, but each time branches cracked or the wind rustled overhead. My attention shot to Toad. He'd be bristling, ears perked, like he expected something to burst out from behind the nearest tree. Neither of us found much rest that week. Later, lying awake in our tent while everyone else slept, I whispered to Toad, "What do you see, boy? What's out there?" He only whined softly in response, pressing his warm body against mine. But his eyes never left the tent entrance, and throughout the night, his muscles remained tense beneath my hand. Winter arrived with unexpected ferocity that year. By December, snow had blanketed our property, transforming the familiar landscape into something alien and imposing. The gravel pits disappeared beneath drifts, and the mountains loomed larger against the stark white horizon. Things escalated further, one bitter January night, when our husky, Luna, Mom's dog who had been with us since before Dad left, decided to sprint off into the darkness. It was bitterly cold, and the fog rolled in so thick you couldn't see more than a few feet in front of you. "She's never done this before," Mom fretted, zipping up her heavy coat. "She must have seen something." My stomach nodded at her words. Seen what? My mom Jenna and I trudged through drifts, following Luna's tracks and calling her name. Toad stayed close to my side, unusually subdued. Eventually we realized we'd need the truck to keep searching, so I volunteered to head back with Toad while they continued on foot. The walk home felt endless. Clumps of snow muffled my steps, and the swirling mist made me lose track of the road. That's when a voice rose from somewhere in the fields, soft at first, but carrying an odd, droning quality that locked onto my attention. It wasn't English, didn't sound like Spanish or any language I recognized either. It reminded me of a chant, yet no ceremony or prayer I've ever heard. Normally, anyone out there would need to yell to be heard from such a distance, but this murmur came through crisp and clear. My pulse hammered as I realized it wasn't just noise, it was beckoning. I stood there, Toad at my side, trying to decide what to do. Despite the biting cold, part of me felt compelled to approach, like the sound had a hook in my gut. Toad saved me again, tugging me forward with a determined yank. I stumbled after him, letting him guide me until the dim shape of our house came into view. After I climbed into the truck and locked the doors, I just sat there, staring at the whitened windows, unsure if I was trembling from the chill or something else. Eventually, I remembered Mom and Jenna were still out there, so I forced myself to drive in Luna's likely direction. We never did manage to catch her that night. She was back by morning, wagging her tail like she'd just gone on a grand adventure. Meanwhile, I was left wondering who or what had been trying to coax me out into the fields. Maybe I was overthinking it, but I couldn't scrub that chanting from my head. It rattled around in my thoughts, especially late at night when the wind would pick up and the desert seemed to draw a little closer to our doorstep. After that night, Luna was never quite the same. She would stare at empty corners, growl at nothing, and sometimes howl in a way that made my skin crawl. Toad avoided her entirely. By spring, I had convinced myself that the winter's strange events were products of isolation and imagination, stress responses to Mom's increasing absence and the mounting responsibilities that fell to me and Jenna. The warming air brought a sense of normalcy, and for a while, life settled into predictable patterns. Then I found the camera. It was an old Polaroid, tucked away in a box of Dad's things Mom had stashed in the attic. On a whim, I checked if it still worked, and to my surprise, it did. There was even half a pack of film inside. I spent a Saturday afternoon taking random shots around the property, Sam attempting skateboard tricks, Jenna reading on the porch, Toad chasing grasshoppers through the tall grass at the edge of our yard. It wasn't until I was reviewing the photos that evening that I noticed something odd. In the background of the picture with Toad, partially obscured by tall grass but unmistakably there, was a figure. Human-shaped but somehow wrong, too tall, too thin, with limbs that seemed slightly longer than they should be. I squinted at the image, trying to make sense of it. It had to be a trick of the light, a random pattern in the grass that my mind was interpreting as human. But no matter how I tried to rationalize it, the figure remained, staring, though I couldn't make out eyes, directly at the camera. I didn't show the photo to anyone. Instead, I became obsessed with capturing the figure again, spending every free moment taking pictures of seemingly empty spaces around our property. Most showed nothing unusual, but occasionally, at the very edge of the frame, there would be something. A blur that shouldn't be there, a shadow that didn't match any visible object, or worst of all, what looked like fingers reaching in from outside the photo's boundary. I began marking on a map of our property where each strange photo was taken. A pattern emerged. They formed a rough circle around our house, with the highest concentration of anomalies appearing in shots taken facing the gravel pits. One evening, while developing a new batch of photos in my makeshift darkroom, the bathroom with towels stuffed under the door, I noticed something I'd missed before. In one of the earliest pictures, the one with Toad in the grass, there was writing behind the figure. Faint but unmistakable letters carved into the air itself. I see you watching. My hands shook so badly that I dropped the photo. It landed, in the developer solution, the image distorting as the chemicals ate away at it. I didn't try to save it. Part of me was relieved to see it destroyed. That night I burned all the strange photos in our backyard fire pit. As they curled and blackened in the flames, I could have sworn I heard distant laughter carried on the wind. Summer arrived again, bringing with it an unexpected development. A construction company from the city purchased the land containing the gravel pits. Heavy machinery appeared overnight, and crews of workers began preliminary excavations for what local gossip claimed would be a small housing development. I should have felt relieved. The strange area that had been the source of so much unease would be transformed into something normal. Populated. Instead, a profound sense of dread settled over me. They shouldn't dig there, I told Jenna one evening as we watched distant bulldozers carving into the earth. Something's not right about that place. She gave me a concerned look. You're being weird again, Michael. Maybe I was. But when the accident started, I knew my instincts had been correct. First, it was equipment failures, machines breaking down inexplicably. Then workers began getting injured. Minor incidents initially, but increasingly severe as the weeks passed. The foreman's sudden heart attack in the middle of the site halted operations for 3 days. When they resumed work, focusing on a particularly deep section of the pits, they found something. The news spread through town with unsettling speed. Workers had uncovered bones, not the expected fossil remains or Native American burial site that would simply require archaeological assessment, but something else entirely. Something that prompted hushed conversations and caused the county sheriff to call in specialists from the state university. I overheard Mom on the phone with her friend who worked at the sheriff's office. They're saying the bones aren't right. Don't fit any known species. Some kind of hoax has to be. Construction halted indefinitely. Chain-link fences with no trespassing signs went up around the perimeter. At night, floodlights illuminated the site and security guards patrolled the boundaries. None of it deterred Sam. "I'm going to see for myself," he announced one night at dinner. At 15, he'd grown as tall as me, his former awkwardness replaced with a reckless confidence I found alarming. "You absolutely are not," Mom said firmly. "That place is dangerous." "It's just bones," Sam argued. "Probably some weird cow hybrid or something." I caught his eye across the table, trying to convey a warning without words. He looked away. That night, I heard him sneaking out. I followed, Toad silent but alert at my side. Sam moved with purpose, taking a familiar path toward the now forbidden gravel pits. I should have called out, should have stopped him, but curiosity kept me quiet. I wanted to know what was really going on at that site. We reached the fence just after midnight. Sam, unaware of my presence, found a section where the ground had eroded beneath the chain link, creating a gap just wide enough to squeeze through. I watched him disappear into the site, then waited several agonizing minutes before following. The excavation was larger than it had appeared from a distance, a massive pit illuminated by powerful floodlights that created harsh shadows in the surrounding areas. In the center stood a white tent, presumably covering whatever had been found. Surprisingly, no guards were visible. I caught up to Sam at the edge of the pit. He was standing motionless, staring down into the excavation. "We need to go," I whispered, grabbing his arm. He didn't respond, didn't even seem to register my presence. His eyes were fixed on the white tent, which had begun to glow from within with a faint blue light. "Sam," I hissed, shaking him. When he finally turned to me, his expression was vacant, his pupils so dilated that his eyes appeared black in the harsh light. "They're coming back," he said in a flat voice that wasn't his own. "They've always been here." A low humming sound emanated from the tent, growing in intensity until I could feel it vibrating in my chest. The floodlights flickered, then went out, plunging us into darkness save for that eerie blue glow. I grabbed Sam and ran, dragging him behind me as he moved with the jerky resistance of a sleepwalker being awakened. Toad led the way, guiding us back to the fence gap. As we squeezed through, alarm sirens began to wail across the site. We ran all the way home, not stopping even when Sam stumbled and scraped his knees badly on the rocky ground. Only when we reached our yard did I realize he was crying, silent tears streaming down his face. "I don't remember," he kept saying. "I don't remember going there. Why did I go there?" I had no answer for him, but as I looked back toward the distant site, now dark again except for emergency vehicle lights flashing at its perimeter, I knew something had changed. A boundary had been crossed, and whatever had been buried in the gravel pits for all these years was finally awake. Now, whenever I stare out the windows at night, I take note of whether the usual farm sounds are present, because the moment that quiet sets in, heavy and complete, I know something might be watching, waiting for a chance to make itself known again. And the worst part is I'm almost certain it won't stop. Toad seems convinced of that too, and that's enough for me to keep every door locked and every light on when the sun goes down. It's been 15 years since that night at the excavation site. Sam recovered, physically at least, though he never regained any memory of why he'd gone there or what he'd seen before I arrived. He left for college at 18 and rarely comes back to visit, always making excuses about work or his girlfriend or the long drive. Jenna stayed longer, helping Mom when her health began to decline 3 years ago. But eventually, she too left, moving to the city where she manages a bookstore and pretends our childhood never happened. I'm the only one who stayed. Someone had to after Mom passed. The house and land came to us jointly, but my siblings were quick to sign over their portions to me. You always loved that place, Jenna said, but her eyes said something different. You're the only one who can live with what's out there. The development project was officially abandoned 2 weeks after our nighttime intrusion. Official reports cited unstable ground conditions and environmental concerns. The bones were never mentioned again publicly, though rumors persisted for years. The chain-link fence remains, rusting and sagging in places, but still marking a boundary few locals willingly cross. I've made certain adjustments to life here. The house is fortified. New locks, security cameras, motion-sensing lights that illuminate every approach. Toad passed years ago, but there's always been another dog since. Always large, always vigilant. My current companion, Rufus, is a Rottweiler mix with a deep bark that carries across the property. I maintain certain rituals, salt lines at thresholds, mirrors positioned to eliminate blind spots. I never go out during those profound silences that still descend without warning, now lasting exactly 17 minutes. I've learned their pattern. Every third night during the waning moon, twice weekly during the full moon, unpredictable but frequent during the new moon. Most importantly, I document everything. The journals that began with sound records have expanded to fill a dedicated room in the house. Detailed accounts of every unusual occurrence, maps marked with activity hotspots, weather correlations, lunar cycles. If there's a pattern to be found, I'm determined to find it. 3 months ago, something changed again. The excavation site, dormant for so many years, showed signs of activity. No machinery or workers this time, but lights, small, bobbing lights that appear just after midnight and move with deliberate purpose across the pits. I observed them through binoculars at first, then graduated to a spotting scope for better detail. They appear to be lanterns carried by figures in dark clothing, though their movements are too synchronized, too fluid to seem entirely human. Last week, I finally worked up the courage to approach during daylight hours. The fence had been cut in several places, creating wide gaps that allowed easy access. Inside, the main pit had been meticulously cleaned, all equipment and debris removed. The ground smoothed as if prepared for something. In the center, where the white tent had once stood, a perfect circle of small teepees had been erected, structures identical to the one my siblings and I had discovered all those years ago. 33 of them, arranged with mathematical precision around a central space that had been dug deeper than the surrounding area. I didn't venture closer. Some instinct, the same one that has kept me alive and vigilant all these years, warned me away. But as I turned to leave, I noticed something that froze my blood. Fresh footprints approaching the site from all directions. Hundreds of them, but none leaving. That night, the lights appeared again, more numerous than before. Through the scope, I could finally make out what carried them. Figures too tall, too thin, moving with that same wrong grace I'd glimpsed in those burned photographs. They gathered in the circle of teepees, lanterns raised high, and began what appeared to be a ceremony. I couldn't hear them from my vantage point, but I could feel the vibration again, that same resonance that had filled the air when Sam and I fled. It built steadily over hours, intensifying until the windows of my house rattled in their frames. Just before dawn, the lights winked out simultaneously. When sunrise illuminated the pits, the teepees were gone. The ground undisturbed as if nothing had been there at all. But something had changed in the atmosphere. A tension, an expectancy that hangs over the land like an approaching storm. The animals feel it too. The neighboring farms report livestock refusing to eat. Dogs barking at empty air, birds abandoning their nests. Last night, standing on my porch with Rufus alert beside me, I heard it again, that almost human mooing from the distant Henderson farm. But this time it was joined by others, a chorus of not quite right animal sounds creating a discordant harmony that carried clearly across the miles. A message, a summoning, a warning. I've packed emergency supplies, food, water, weapons, the most important of my journals. The truck is fueled and ready, but I know deep down that running isn't the answer. Whatever has awakened here, whatever has been watching us all these years, isn't confined to this place. It never was. The gravel pits were just where it chose to reveal itself first. Tonight, as the sun sets, I'll be watching from my porch. Rufus will stand guard, though I know he can't protect me from what's coming. The lights will appear again. They've been growing more numerous each night, and eventually, I'll have to make a choice. continue observing from a distance, or finally confront what my family disturbed all those years ago. Either way, I know this. We were never alone here. This land was never truly ours. We've always been the intruders, building our homes and lives on hollow ground that has been patiently waiting to reclaim its own. God help us all when it finally does. I still recall how the quiet wrapped around that old house like a heavy blanket. Back then, our little place on the Navajo reservation didn't have electricity, so the only light came from lanterns glowing in the living room. My two brothers and I were left alone that night, since our parents had headed to a chapter house meeting. It wasn't the first time they'd left us to watch over things, but something about that evening felt off. We'd gone through our usual routine, made a quick dinner from whatever we could rustle up. Growing up on the reservation taught me to appreciate the simplicity of our lives. We lived miles from the nearest town, surrounded by vast stretches of desert and mesa that seemed to extend forever under an endless sky. Our modest home stood as a lone sentinel against the elements, a small, weathered structure that had sheltered generations of my family through harsh winters and scorching summers. The isolation never bothered me before. In fact, I found comfort in the rhythm of our daily existence. The rituals of gathering water, tending to livestock, and maintaining our small garden plot. My brothers and I developed a deep connection to the land, learning its secrets through stories passed down by our grandparents who lived just down the road. Grandfather always emphasized the importance of respecting the natural world. Everything has a spirit, he would say, his weathered hands gesturing toward the horizon. The mountains, the water, the wind, they all remember how you treat them. As children, we absorbed these teachings without question, incorporating them into our understanding of reality. But as we grew older, we began to recognize the complex relationship between these traditional beliefs and the modern world that existed beyond our isolated corner of the reservation. My older brother embraced the old ways completely, spending hours with grandfather learning prayers and rituals. My younger brother seemed torn, fascinated by stories of city life he heard at school. I fell somewhere in between, respecting our heritage while curiosity pulled me toward experiences beyond our secluded home. That tension between worlds created a unique vulnerability, especially on nights when our parents attended tribal meetings. The responsibilities of maintaining the household fell to us, creating a strange power dynamic that shifted with each sunset. As the middle child, I often found myself mediating between my brothers' conflicting approaches to problems. The night everything changed began ordinarily enough. Mom and Dad packed a few belongings into their old pickup truck, promising to return by morning. "Keep the lanterns lit," Mom reminded us, adjusting her shawl against the cooling evening air. "And remember what Grandfather taught you about protecting the home." Dad nodded in agreement. "Stay inside after dark. The reservation's been having trouble with trespassers lately." He didn't elaborate, but the grave look in his eyes conveyed more than words could express. We watched their taillights disappear down the dirt road, unaware that their absence would set in motion events that would forever alter our perception of reality. As darkness settled around our home, we completed our chores with practiced efficiency, falling into the comfortable routine that defined our evenings alone. Then, cleaned the few dishes by lamplight. My brothers joked around while I tried to relax, but I couldn't help peering at the windows. The desert night was always dark, yet that particular night felt like it was pressing against the walls. Once we finished our chores, we set the lanterns on the kitchen table and sat down. We had no television or internet, so we just chatted in low voices about the day. The air smelled of warm dust and the faint smoke left over from our wood stove. We were tired, but not quite ready to sleep. Outside, the wind whispered across the empty land. Usually that lullaby would put me at ease, but my instincts kept buzzing like an alarm. Suddenly, we heard something out by the truck, a shuffling noise that wasn't the wind. It was like someone was shifting around boxes or picking things up and dropping them. My brothers and I stared at each other, realizing nobody should be out there at that hour. The closest neighbors lived miles away, and they'd never just drop by unannounced. My oldest brother crept toward the window, letting the lantern's glow guide him. He peered through a small gap in the curtain. I watched his face go pale. That's when he whispered that someone was digging around in the truck. A tightness clenched my stomach. Why would a stranger sneak onto our property so far from town, let alone rifle through our vehicle? It didn't take long for fear to settle in. I can still remember the way my brother's hands trembled as he backed away from the window. His eyes, wide with panic, reflected the dancing lantern flame. "Someone's out there," he whispered, voice barely audible above the persistent desert wind. "They're going through Dad's truck." The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. We huddled closer together, instinctively seeking protection in proximity. My younger brother, usually quick with jokes and laughter, sat frozen in his chair. His knuckles whitened as he gripped the edge of the table. "What do they look like?" I managed to ask, though part of me dreaded the answer. My older brother shook his head. "Too dark to see clearly. Just a shape moving around the cab." He swallowed hard. "But something's wrong about it. The way it moves." That hesitation, that inability to articulate what disturbed him so deeply, intensified my fear more than any detailed description could have. In that moment, I became acutely aware of our vulnerability. 3 teenagers alone in an isolated house with no means of communication, no neighbors within shouting distance, and parents who wouldn't return until morning. The sounds outside continued, metal scraping against metal, the creak of the truck's door hinge, occasional thumps that suggested items being tossed aside. Whatever was out there moved with purpose, searching for something specific. "Maybe it's just someone looking for food or supplies," my younger brother suggested, voice cracking. "They might leave if they don't find anything valuable." But even as he spoke, I sensed he didn't believe his own words. This wasn't a desperate traveler or opportunistic thief. Something about the systematic nature of the search, the boldness of approaching an occupied home, suggested a more sinister intent. My older brother moved to the corner where Dad kept his hunting rifle. The weapon had always been a silent presence in our home, necessary for protection but rarely touched. I watched as he carefully lifted it from its mount, checking that it was loaded with trembling fingers. "We should call out," I suggested. "Let them know we're here and armed." He shook his head. "Not yet. If they're just looking to steal, they'll run when they know we've spotted them. But if they're looking for—" He didn't finish the thought, but he didn't need to. We'd all heard stories of violence on the reservation, incidents that went unreported in mainstream news but traveled through community whispers. The minutes stretched painfully as we debated our options. The intruder showed no signs of leaving, and our fear grew with each passing moment. Finally, my older brother made a decision. "We need to confront them," he said firmly. "All of us together. Show strength." We glanced around the living room, trying to figure out a plan. There wasn't exactly a phone to call for help. No landline, no cell service out here. My younger brother fumbled for the rifle we kept near the door, the one we almost never touched. He handed it to me like he couldn't stand the thought of holding it himself. I took it, feeling my hands tremble. The idea of facing down someone in the pitch-black yard made my head spin. But what choice did we have? We needed to protect our home. We decided to step out onto the porch, see if we could scare them off. My heart thumped against my chest, each beat reminding me just how alone we were. We eased open the front door. The night air rushed in, cold and full of possibilities. Lantern lights spilled over the porch steps, but it didn't reach the truck. We strained our eyes, searching for any sign of movement. For several seconds, we couldn't see anything, just the vague outline of the vehicle and shadow stretching over the dirt yard. But there was that sound again, like metal scraping. Something was definitely out there, and it wasn't some friendly neighbor. I whispered to my brothers that we needed to stick together. The rifle felt heavier than it ever had, like it knew trouble was near. In the darkness, I thought I saw a shape move near the truck's open door. My pulse hammered. Part of me wanted to shout for whoever it was to leave. Another part worried that calling out might provoke them. We just stood there, silent, hearts pounding, trying to catch a glimpse of this unwelcome visitor who had appeared out of nowhere. And I had the strangest sense that we were being watched in return. I eased onto the porch with my brothers huddled behind me, lantern in one hand, rifle in the other. The rattling sound we'd heard before had stopped, but that only made me more anxious. Even in the faint glow, I could spot the truck a few yards away. The passenger door was open wider than it had been just minutes ago. Whoever was messing with it was clearly not done. My older brother whispered for the intruder to come out and explain themselves, voice shaking despite his effort to sound tough. Silence answered back. An unsettling quiet so deep it seemed the entire desert paused to listen. Then a shape rose by the truck's open door. It turned toward the house, slow and deliberate. My stomach tightened. The figure stood unnaturally still, a darker shadow against the night. Distance and darkness obscured details, but something about its proportions seemed wrong. Too tall, too thin, with angles that defied normal human anatomy. My mind struggled to process what my eyes were seeing, automatically trying to fit this anomaly into familiar categories. "Who's there?" My older brother called out, his voice stronger than before. "This is private property." The figure remained motionless for several heartbeats, then tilted its head at an impossible angle, as if considering us from a perspective that wasn't quite right. The gesture sent waves of revulsion through me, not because of what I could see, but because of what I could sense. An overwhelming feeling of wrongness emanated from the intruder, something that transcended ordinary fear. My younger brother pressed against my back, his breath coming in quick, shallow gasps. "Something's not right," he whispered, his words barely audible. "That doesn't look like a person." I wanted to dismiss his observation, to cling to rational explanations, but the evidence before us defied reason. Normal trespassers don't stand motionless observing their victims. They don't move with such deliberate, unnatural precision, and they certainly don't emanate the sense of ancient malevolence that radiated from this entity. Something about the way it moved stole all sense of security. I raised the rifle, bracing it against my shoulder, and said that we weren't afraid. The shape didn't react beyond standing perfectly still for a moment. The lantern's light barely reached the edge of the yard, so I could only make out an outline. Tall, maybe hunched, definitely not normal. Its stillness unnerved me more than any lunge or sudden motion could have. My brother urged me to fire a warning shot just over its head, in hopes of scaring it off. I pulled the trigger and a dull click echoed in my ears. Nothing. I tried again. Still nothing. Every desperate pull only produced more clicks. The rifle felt dead in my hands. I remember panicking because we'd used that gun a few times in the past and it never had problems. Yet at that moment it behaved as if it had no intention of defending us. The figure took a step forward. The failure of the rifle sent a surge of terror through my body. This wasn't a mechanical malfunction. The weapon had been meticulously maintained, cleaned after every use, stored properly. Dad had taught us the importance of gun care from an early age. "Your life might depend on it someday," he'd warned, words that now echoed with prophetic clarity. The entity seemed to sense our growing fear. It took another step forward, its movement fluid yet somehow disjointed, as if its limbs connected differently than human anatomy would allow. The distance between us was shrinking, and our only means of defense had failed. "Get back inside," my older brother hissed, positioning himself between us and the approaching figure. "Lock the door and block it with furniture." But retreat felt impossible, my feet frozen to the wooden planks of the porch. Running seemed futile against something that had deliberately sought us out, that had traveled miles of desert darkness to find our isolated home. And a wave of rot wafted over the porch. It smelled like something decaying in the heat, so potent it made me want to gag. My brothers backed away, alarm plain on their faces. I held the rifle up again, refusing to drop it even though it seemed useless. It was the only thing keeping me from freezing with fear. Just then, a flicker of light glimmered down the road. Through the sparse trees, I could see a pair of headlights bouncing along the dirt path. The stench overwhelmed my senses, not just decay, but something deeper and more primal. It carried notes of disturbed earth, stagnant water, and something unmistakably organic yet profoundly wrong. The odor triggered instinctive revulsion, a biological warning system screaming that we faced something unnatural. My younger brother retched, doubling over as he fought to control his nausea. Even my older brother, always the strongest among us, visibly recoiled. The putrid cloud seemed to have substance wrapping around us like tendrils of fog. The approaching headlights cut through the darkness like divine intervention. Hope surged through me, not just for rescue, but for witnesses, for confirmation that what we were experiencing was real and not some shared delusion born of isolation and fear. Relief and dread warred inside me. My grandparents were home, which was good. But what if this intruder decided to target them too? The shape shifted its attention to the approaching lights and slowly peeled away from the truck. Before we could react, it slid behind one of the large, gnarled trees that dotted our property. I'd never felt such a potent mix of fury and terror. Part of me wanted to chase after it, demanding answers. The other half wanted to retreat inside, block every door and pray that the thing wouldn't return. I heard my grandparents pull up and hop out of the car. My oldest brother raced across the yard to meet them, rifle in hand, telling them in frantic whispers about the intruder. My grandfather eyed the open truck door, then focused on the tree line. Without needing an explanation, he dashed inside, rummaged around for ashes from the stove. He coated the barrel and a single bullet, working quickly and calmly. Grandfather's immediate understanding of the situation chilled me more thoroughly than the entity itself. There was no surprise in his weathered face, no disbelief or confusion, only grim recognition. He knew what we were facing without being told, as if he'd been expecting this encounter for years. I watched in fascination as his hands moved with practiced precision, coating the rifle barrel with gray ash from our wood stove. His lips moved in silent prayer, words in Navajo too quiet for me to catch. The ritual seemed ancient, passed down through generations as protection against forces most people no longer believed in. "What is that thing?" I whispered when he returned to the porch. Grandfather's eyes met mine, filled with a weight of knowledge I couldn't comprehend. "Something that should not be here," he answered simply. "Something that has forgotten its place in the world." His cryptic response frustrated me, but I recognized the protective intent behind his vagueness. Some knowledge was dangerous to possess, some names dangerous to speak. In that moment, I understood why certain stories were only told in winter, why certain rituals were performed away from young ears. "The gun wouldn't fire," my older brother explained, voice strained with residual fear. Grandfather nodded as if this were entirely expected. "Of course not. It knows the ways of our world." He checked the ash-coated bullet, sliding it into the chamber with reverence. "But we know older ways," like he'd practiced this before. When he came back out, we clustered around him. My grandmother stood protectively near me and my younger brother. My grandfather strode to the edge of the porch and aimed at the place where we'd last seen that shape lurking. He fired without shouting a warning, one thunderous blast that broke the suffocating stillness. For an instant, I thought he'd missed until a shrieking cry tore through the night. A shadow ripped away from the tree and tore across the yard. The inhuman scream seared itself into my memory, a sound that existed somewhere between animal pain and human rage, yet was neither. It resonated at a frequency that seemed to vibrate through bone rather than air, triggering instinctive terror at a biological level. The entity's movement as it fled was equally disturbing. Not the steady gait of a person running, not the bounded leap of a four-legged animal, but something in between. Its limbs extended and contracted in impossible ways, covering ground with unnatural speed. Grandmother pulled us closer, her thin arms surprisingly strong across our shoulders. "Don't look directly at it," she warned. "It takes something from you when you witness its true form." I averted my eyes, focusing instead on Grandfather's determined expression. He maintained his aim, tracking the fleeing shadow until it disappeared beyond the reach of our lantern light. Only then did he lower the rifle, his shoulders slumping slightly with released tension. "Will it come back?" my younger brother asked, voice small with lingering fear. Grandfather considered the question carefully. "Not tonight," he finally answered, "but it has marked this place now. Marked all of you." He turned to face us fully, his expression grave. "There are preparations we must make." Heading farther into the desert. We didn't stop to question what it was or how it was still moving after that shot. My grandfather and my older brother raced for the truck, engine roaring as they gave chase. I stood there, surrounded by lantern glow, trying not to let my mind wander too far into dark possibilities. The stench lingered in the air, as if whatever that thing was had left a piece of itself behind. All I could do was cling to the thought that if anybody could handle it. The sudden departure left me, my younger brother, and grandmother alone in the eerie aftermath. The night seemed to press closer without Grandfather's reassuring presence, shadows deepening in corners that had never bothered me before. Every creak of the old house, every whisper of wind through the juniper trees took on sinister potential. Grandmother moved with purpose, retrieving items from various places around the house, a small leather pouch from beneath the floorboard, dried herbs from a kitchen cabinet, a carved wooden box I'd never seen before. She worked methodically, laying these objects on the kitchen table before retrieving a container of cornmeal from the pantry. "Don't just stand there," she instructed, her voice gentle but firm. "We have work to do before they return." She guided us through the process of creating protective symbols at each entrance, doorways, windows, even the small bathroom vent. We traced precise patterns with cornmeal, while she recited prayers in Navajo, teaching us the words and correcting our pronunciation with patient insistence. "These words are your heritage," she explained as we worked. "They connect you to those who came before, who faced these same challenges and survived." My younger brother, still pale with fear, found comfort in the ritual. His hands steadied as he completed each symbol, his breathing becoming more regular. I envied his ability to surrender fully to faith, to accept protection without questioning its mechanism. My own mind raced with unanswered questions. What exactly had invaded our property? Why had it chosen our family? How could grandfather track something that moved with such unnatural speed through pitch darkness? Most disturbingly, how had he known exactly what to do? As if he'd been preparing for this specific threat. "Grandmother," I ventured as we finished the last symbol. "What is happening? Please, I need to understand." She studied my face for a long moment, weighing something in her mind. Finally, she sighed and gestured for us to sit at the kitchen table. "There are those who choose dark paths," she began, her voice low. "People who trade their humanity for power, who break the most sacred taboos. Skinwalkers," my younger brother whispered, the forbidden word slipping out before he could stop himself. Grandmother's expression hardened. "We do not name them," she admonished. "Names have power. But yes, that is what the outside world calls them." She explained in careful terms that danced around direct statements how certain individuals corrupted traditional knowledge for personal gain, how they underwent rituals of such profound transgression that they forfeited their connection to humanity, how they gained abilities that defied natural law but lost their souls in the process. "But why us?" I pressed, needing to understand our role in this nightmare. "Your grandfather refused to look away when others chose blindness," she answered simply. "Some in our community prefer peace at any price, even if that price is silent complicity." This revelation opened a new dimension of understanding about my grandfather, not just a traditional man living by old ways, but a deliberate guardian standing against forces others preferred to ignore. His occasional unexplained absences, his insistence on teaching us certain protective rituals, his watchfulness during certain phases of the moon, all took on new significance. Our conversation ended abruptly as headlights swept across the kitchen window. Grandfather's truck had returned. It was my grandfather. He'd clearly known something about dusting the rifle in ashes, a trick I'd never heard of before. Still, that encounter had rattled us. We weren't prepared for how close danger had come or how little we could do about it. And even though the worst part seemed over, I couldn't shake the notion that the fight was only just beginning. Grandfather and my older brother didn't hesitate after that shot rang out. They jumped into the truck and tore off into the desert, leaving me, my other brother, and grandmother huddled on the porch. My thoughts kept spinning as the taillights blinked across the uneven ground. Part of me wished I could have gone with them, though my legs felt too unsteady to stand. I was stuck there, hoping they wouldn't be lured somewhere even worse in that darkness. It felt like ages before we heard the engines roar again, faint at first, then growing louder as it rolled back toward the house. When the truck finally crested the rise, Grandfather slammed on the brakes. The tires kicked up a cloud of dust that lingered, and in the shifting beams of the headlights I saw my older brother's stunned face. They both climbed out, eyes full of the kind of urgency that meant no one was getting any rest tonight. Grandfather told us how they chased the figure beyond a steep ditch that dropped off at least 20 feet. He slammed on the brakes in time to avoid tumbling over the edge. My older brother's hands trembled as he described what they'd witnessed. His voice kept breaking, forcing him to stop and collect himself before continuing. The confident teenager I'd known my entire life had been replaced by someone fundamentally shaken. "It wasn't running like a person," he explained, gesturing with jerky movements. "More like crawling fast, but not on hands and knees. The joints were all wrong." Grandfather nodded gravely. "What you saw was not its true form," he explained. "It shifts between shapes, never fully human, never fully animal. The transition is what you witnessed." The clinical detachment in his voice suggested intimate knowledge of these entities. Not second-hand information from stories, but personal experience. I wondered how many times he had faced such threats without ever speaking of them to us. Then he leapt out to confront it. My brother swore that each time the headlights caught the runner, it flickered into the shape of a woman loping on all fours, her limbs bending in ways that defied reason. At the brink of that ditch, grandfather shouted in Navajo, naming a local woman he suspected was behind this evil. He demanded she leave us in peace, warning she'd pay if she persisted. They saw it pause like it understood every syllable. This revelation, that the horror we faced had a human origin, an identity known to grandfather, somehow made everything more terrifying. Not a nameless ancient evil, but someone who lived among us who might have smiled and nodded to us at community gatherings. "How did you know?" I asked, struggling to reconcile this information with my understanding of our small community. Grandfather's expression darkened. "There have been signs. Livestock found mutilated in specific ways, strange tracks around homes where children have fallen ill, whispers of someone seen in places they couldn't possibly be." He had been investigating these incidents quietly, gathering evidence while others dismissed them as coyote attacks or coincidence. The confrontation tonight confirmed his suspicions about who was responsible. "Naming her was dangerous," grandmother interjected, concern evident in her voice. "You've tied your spirit to hers now." Grandfather nodded solemnly. "It was necessary. The boundary has been drawn." He turned to us, his gaze intense. "Now we prepare. She will not forgive being exposed." The realization that our family had become entangled in something so much larger and more dangerous than a simple trespassing incident settled heavily upon me. This wasn't over, it was merely beginning. Then it released a guttural hiss and bolted deeper into the desert. Even with the rifle loaded properly, hitting a figure so fast in the dead of night was nearly impossible. Not wanting to risk a rollover or get led into unfamiliar terrain, grandfather made the call to turn back. The realization that it was far too cunning to corner made everything feel worse. We locked up the house as best we could, blocking the doors and pulling the curtains. My brothers and I sat around the lantern, each of us jumping at the slightest rustle. Grandmother said a prayer in a trembling voice, hands pressed together. Meanwhile, grandfather kept that ash-coated rifle at his side, keeping watch at a window. I could see the weight of the night in his posture, determined but exhausted. No one slept until dawn. Every creak set us on edge, hearts pounding as we wondered if that thing had decided to return. The tension in that long night transformed our understanding of darkness. Shadows weren't just absence of light anymore. They were potential vessels for malevolence. Each corner of our familiar home became suspect. Each unexpected sound a possible harbinger of return. Grandmother kept us busy with protective measures, teaching us prayers and rituals that had been passed down through generations. My younger brother embraced these teachings with newfound reverence, finding comfort in tradition that had previously seemed irrelevant to modern life. My older brother remained vigilant, positioned near grandfather at the window, absorbing whatever knowledge the old man shared in hushed Navajo. Their conversation excluded me, not deliberately but through my limited grasp of our ancestral language, a deficiency I now regretted deeply. I occupied the uncomfortable middle ground, too rational to surrender completely to traditional beliefs, yet too shaken by what I'd witnessed to dismiss them. The entity had been undeniably real, its presence confirmed by everyone present. Yet it defied the natural laws I'd been taught in school, existing in a realm where science offered no protection. Dawn arrived with agonizing slowness, pale light gradually revealing the familiar landscape of our property. The mundane reality of juniper trees, weathered fence posts, and distant mesas stood in stark contrast to the nightmare of the previous night. In the first gray light of morning, we ventured out. The sickly sweet stench had faded, but muddy footprints remained by the truck. None of them looked like a neat pair of shoes. The prints were splayed with deep indentations that reminded me of paw marks more than anything human. Over the next few days, our whole household operated like we were on constant alert. A few neighbors dropped by, hearing whispers that our family had crossed paths with something foul. The footprints defied explanation, too large for coyote or wolf, yet not matching any human shoe pattern. They began normally near the truck but gradually elongated and distorted as they tracked across the yard, becoming increasingly animalistic before disappearing altogether near the property boundary. Grandfather photographed them with an old Polaroid camera before carefully erasing each print with a mixture of ash and salt. He worked methodically, murmuring prayers over each one before moving to the next. The ritual took most of the morning, leaving him visibly drained. News traveled quickly through the small community. Neighbors arrived throughout the day, ostensibly bringing food or offering help with chores, but their curious glances and hushed conversations revealed their true purpose. They wanted confirmation of rumors already circulating, that the old threats were active again, that traditional protections were necessary once more. Some expressed skepticism, attributing our experience to overactive imagination or misidentification of an ordinary trespasser. Others shared their own encounters in hushed tones, stories they had previously kept hidden for fear of ridicule or concern about attracting unwanted attention. We tried to make light of it, but people exchanged grave looks, each recalling stories of their own strange encounters. Then we heard the news. The same local woman grandfather had named that night passed away under mysterious circumstances. Nobody could explain exactly what happened. Some said she fell ill suddenly, others blamed old age, but the timing left us uneasy. It was grandfather's silence that told me everything. He insisted we show respect. The woman's passing sent ripples of unease through the community. She had been a reclusive figure, living alone on the outskirts of the reservation in a house rarely visited by neighbors. Few attended her funeral, but those who did reported strange phenomena, unexplained cold spots, electronic devices failing, a persistent sense of being watched. Grandfather maintained strict silence regarding any connection between our experience and her death. When pressed, he would only say, "What returns to the earth belongs to the earth now. Let the dead rest." But I noticed new protective measures appearing around our property, bundles of herbs hanging from eaves, complex symbols carved into fence posts, strands of horsehair strung across certain windows. The incident marked a turning point in my relationship with my heritage. The traditional knowledge I had previously viewed as quaint stories for children revealed itself as a sophisticated system for navigating threats beyond modern understanding. My education in tribal ways intensified. No longer casual lessons, but urgent transmission of survival knowledge. Keep our heads down and remain cautious. He refused to talk further about the woman's passing, but I glimpsed the relief etched on his face. From what I'd heard around the reservation, if you call out a skinwalker, if you speak their name, you're essentially dooming them. Maybe it was a coincidence, or maybe grandfather's act of naming her truly sealed her fate. Whatever the explanation, the stench and the footprints vanished. Our dogs barked less. In the months that followed, life gradually returned to normal rhythms, but with subtle differences. Our family's vigilance never fully relaxed. New routines incorporated protective practices that became second nature, checking for tracks each morning, maintaining small offerings at property boundaries, observing certain taboos regarding discussion of specific topics after sunset. The experience changed us individually as well. My younger brother embraced traditional ways completely, apprenticing himself to grandfather and other tribal elders. My older brother became more protective, eventually pursuing a career in tribal law enforcement, and I found myself drawn to documenting and preserving our stories, recognizing that what seemed like superstition to outsiders often contained vital truths encoded in metaphor and symbolism. Years have passed since that night, and I've witnessed similar encounters throughout the reservation, enough to confirm that our experience wasn't isolated or unique. Some skeptics attribute these phenomena to mass hysteria, psychological projection, or misidentification of natural animals. Others point to environmental contaminants, poverty-induced stress, or internalized cultural trauma as explanations. As territory had been reclaimed by friendlier spirits, nights felt a little safer, though the rifle still leaned by the front door. Ashes kept close at hand. The memory of that figure's slow advance and the way the gun wouldn't fire stuck with me longer than anything else. Even now, whenever shadows move weirdly after dusk, I remember that night. Some folks think these tales are nothing but superstition. I understand the impulse to rationalize, to seek explanations that fit within comfortable paradigms. Before that night, I might have done the same. But having witnessed something that violated natural law, having seen multiple rational people confirm the same inexplicable phenomena, I can no longer dismiss these experiences so easily. The world contains more layers than modern society acknowledges, more possibilities than science has catalogued. The boundaries between known and unknown, natural and supernatural, remain more permeable than most people realize. I don't expect others to believe without experiencing for themselves. Skepticism is healthy, especially regarding phenomena that defy conventional explanation. But I would caution against dismissing traditional knowledge simply because it doesn't align with current understanding. Our ancestors developed sophisticated systems for navigating threats they encountered repeatedly over generations. But I lived through one too many coincidences to dismiss them. Maybe the woman was just a person who knew dark tricks, or maybe she truly turned into something not quite human. Either way, I learned that in the isolation of our land, there are forces you don't challenge unless you're ready to face the consequences. By the time my parents returned to their routine of chapter house visits, I'd grown used to being on guard. The chills from that encounter never fully went away. But I found a strange comfort in knowing we survived it. We held our ground. That was enough. And on those quiet nights when the moon's out and the wind rustles the dry brush, I remind myself that evil's real. But so is resilience. Our family proved that much. I never believed in folklore or ghost stories growing up in Western New York. To me, they were just bedtime tales designed to keep kids from wandering too far from home. At least that's what I used to think. Now, after what happened at Black Hollow Cabin, I understand why our ancestors created those warnings. Some things are better left undisturbed, some places better left unexplored. I grew up in a small town near the Catskills, where my father worked as a park ranger and my mother taught biology at the local high school. They instilled in me a deep respect for nature, but also a scientific mindset. Everything had an explanation, they taught me. Everything followed natural laws. I carried that certainty through my childhood and into my teens, even as I heard the old stories about things that lived in the deep woods, about hikers who disappeared and were never found. Our group came together naturally over the years. Eli Mitchell I'd known since elementary school, a quiet, thoughtful guy who could identify any bird by its call and track deer through the densest underbrush. His father had taught him wilderness survival skills, and he passed that knowledge on to me during countless weekend camping trips. Tess Rodriguez joined our circle in 9th grade when her family moved up from Florida. She was fearless, the kind of person who would climb the tallest trees just to see what the view was like from the top. She never quite got used to our cold winters, but she loved the mountains with a passion that matched my own. Connor Walsh was the wild card. He transferred to our school in junior year and immediately clicked with our group, bringing an energy and spontaneity that balanced out our more cautious natures. He came from old money, though you'd never know it by his worn jeans and beat-up pickup truck. His family owned property all through the mountains, including, as we would later learn, Black Hollow Cabin. Megan Chen was the last to join our circle, moving to town in senior year. She was brilliant, headed to Cornell on a full scholarship to study environmental science. She and Connor started dating almost immediately, one of those high school romances that seemed destined to last forever. Now I can't think about either of them without remembering how it all ended. We were all 19 that summer of '98, caught in that strange limbo between high school and whatever came next. College loomed ahead of us. I was headed to SUNY, Eli to Vermont, Tess to Boston University. We wanted one last adventure together before our lives pulled us in different directions. That's what Connor promised us with Black Hollow Cabin. One last weekend in the mountains, just the 5 of us. Looking back, there were warning signs from the beginning. The way Connor's uncle hesitated when he handed over the keys. The strange looks we got from locals when we stopped for supplies. The fact that no one could quite tell us how to get there. But we were young and invincible, or so we thought. What could possibly go wrong in a cabin in the woods? I remember the last normal moment before everything changed. We were sitting around the scarred kitchen table playing cards, warm light spilling from the old kerosene lamp. Megan's laugh echoing off the wooden walls as Connor told another of his ridiculous stories. The windows were dark mirrors reflecting our faces back at us, and beyond them the forest waited. None of us knew it then, but that forest had been waiting for a very long time. The planning started innocently enough. Connor showed us pictures of the cabin on his phone, an old two-story structure built in the 1920s, all weathered wood and stone chimney. It looked rustic but charming, nestled in a clearing surrounded by ancient maples and pines. My uncle hasn't used it much lately, Connor said, scrolling through the photos. Says it needs some work, but it's got running water and electricity. We'll have the whole place to ourselves. I noticed he avoided mentioning why his uncle had stopped using it, but at the time it didn't seem important. Eli, ever practical, insisted on proper preparation. We spent weeks gathering supplies, sleeping bags rated for cold weather, emergency flares, first aid kits, extra batteries for flashlights. The nearest town is 2 hours away, he reminded us. We need to be self-sufficient. Tess mapped out hiking trails in the area, marking potential routes on topographical maps. But something was off. The cabin's location didn't quite match any official maps. When she mentioned this to Connor, he shrugged it off. The property's been in my family forever. Some of these trails don't show up on modern maps. Megan, studying the weather forecast, frowned at her laptop. That's weird, she said. The temperature predictions for that area are all over the place. It's like the weather patterns don't make sense. I remember helping her pack her camera gear the night before we left. She was excited about photographing the local wildlife, especially the deer that Connor said frequently visited the clearing around the cabin. There's something special about that place, he'd told us. The animals act different there. None of us thought to ask what he meant by different. We left early Friday morning, Connor's truck loaded with our gear. The drive started normally enough, highways giving way to state roads, then to increasingly narrow mountain paths. But as we turned onto the unmarked gravel road that led to the cabin, something changed. The forest pressed closer, branches reaching over the road like grasping fingers. The air grew thick and heavy, making it hard to breathe. Even the sunlight seemed different, filtering through the leaves in strange patterns that made my eyes hurt if I looked at them too long. Anyone else feel that? Tess asked from the back seat, her voice tight. Like pressure in your ears? We all nodded. It was like descending in an airplane, but worse, a deep, throbbing sensation that made my teeth ache. The cabin appeared suddenly around a bend, looking exactly like the photos, but somehow more imposing in person. The windows were dark, reflecting the trees in a way that made them look like they were moving inside the glass. As we unloaded our gear, I noticed something odd about the clearing. There were no birds singing, no insects buzzing. Just complete, unnatural silence. The first night passed uneventfully, but none of us slept well. The silence was oppressive, broken only by occasional sounds that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, like something large moving through the trees, but never visible from the windows. Saturday morning, we decided to explore the surrounding woods. The trail Tess had mapped led us deeper into the forest, where the trees grew older and stranger. Their trunks were twisted into unnatural shapes, bark scarred with marks that looked disturbingly like written symbols. Then we found the clearing. It was perfectly circular, about 30 feet across. Every plant within its boundaries was dead, the ground covered in a layer of ash-gray moss that seemed to pulse slightly when you looked at it too long. But it was what we found in the center that made my blood run cold. Bones, arranged in a complex pattern that couldn't have been natural. Some were clearly animal, deer, maybe wolf, but others looked human. And they were all pointing towards something. A cave entrance half hidden by fallen trees, its mouth a perfect black oval in the rock face. We should go, Eli said, his voice barely a whisper. Now. As we turned to leave, Megan's camera clicked. The sound echoed strangely in the clearing, and something answered from the cave. A low, wet sound that might have been breathing. We ran. That night, things got worse. The temperature dropped rapidly, frost forming on the inside of the windows despite the summer heat. We huddled around the fireplace, trying to convince ourselves there were rational explanations for everything we'd seen. Then Megan went missing. 1 minute she was there, getting up to use the bathroom. The next gone. The bathroom window was open, though we all swore it had been closed. Outside, her footprints led toward the woods, but they changed as they went, becoming longer, deeper, wrong. We had to search for her. Connor grabbed his rifle, Eli took the flares and Tess carried the first aid kit. I brought up the rear with the most powerful flashlight we had. The beam seemed weak against the darkness, which felt almost solid, pressing against us like cold hands. We found her camera first, lying in the dead clearing. The screen was cracked but still working, showing the last photo she'd taken. A figure standing in the cave mouth. It was tall, impossibly tall, with limbs that bent in too many places. Its face was... I still can't describe its face. My mind won't let me. That's when we heard Megan scream. Not from the cave, but from above us. We looked up and there it was, moving through the treetops like a spider, carrying something that might have been Megan but wasn't anymore. Connor fired. The sound was deafening in the clearing, but the creature didn't seem to notice. Instead it laughed, a sound like breaking glass and crying children mixed together. More figures emerged from the cave. They moved like liquid shadow, their forms constantly shifting between things I recognized. Deer, bear, human, and things that couldn't exist in our world. Run. Eli screamed, lighting a flare. The red light seemed to hurt them. They recoiled, their forms rippling like heat waves over hot pavement. What happened next is fragmented in my memory. Running through the woods, branches whipping our faces, Tess falling, being pulled into the darkness as she screamed, Connor emptying his rifle into something that used to be Megan. Eli's last flare revealing dozens of creatures surrounding us, herding us back toward the cabin. I remember the cabin's windows glowing with a pale corpse light from within. Remember Connor saying, "I'm sorry," before stepping into their midst, arms spread wide. Remember Eli pushing me toward his truck, starting the engine as things with too many limbs and too many eyes crashed through the underbrush behind us. We made it to the highway somehow. Eli was bleeding from wounds that wouldn't stop changing shape. He died before we reached the hospital, his last words a warning. Don't let them follow us back. The official investigation went nowhere. Missing persons reports were filed. Search parties found nothing. Not the cabin, not the cave, not even the clearing. Connor's uncle claimed there had never been a cabin on their property. My dreams are haunted by what I saw in those woods. Sometimes I wake up to find frost on my windows in the middle of summer, or catch glimpses of impossible shapes moving at the edge of my vision. Over the years, I've heard stories. Other groups of friends who ventured into those mountains and never returned. Hikers finding clearings with arranged bones, strange sounds in the night that make people's teeth ache. I've connected with others who survived similar encounters. They speak of ancient things that live in the dark places of the world. Things that wear human shapes but aren't human at all. Things that hunger not just for flesh but for something deeper, consciousness, identity, soul. I still live in the area, though I never go into the woods anymore. Sometimes on very quiet nights I think I can hear them, that wet, strange laughter carried on the wind. And sometimes when I look at old photos of my friends, their faces seem to shift and change, becoming something else entirely. I know they're still out there, waiting in the darkness between the trees. And I know that someday, they'll find their way back to our world. The cabin was just a doorway, one of many. The real horror isn't that such things exist. It's that they've always been here, watching, waiting, wearing familiar faces until the moment they choose to reveal themselves. If you're planning a trip to the mountains, my advice is simple. Stick to marked trails. Don't explore unknown cabins. And if you find yourself in a place where the silence feels wrong and the trees seem to watch you, run. Run as fast and as far as you can. Because sometimes, the monsters in our stories aren't just stories. Sometimes they're memories of things that were here long before us, things that will remain long after we're gone. And sometimes, they get hungry. I've always been drawn to the outdoors, but not in the way Ben was. While he was scaling mountains and camping in the wilderness by age 12, I was the kind of hiker who stuck to marked trails and carried too much water. Growing up in Seattle meant the mountains were always calling, but I answered cautiously, preferring the well-worn paths of Discovery Park to the rugged backcountry. That's probably why Ben and I clicked when we met during freshman orientation at UW. He was everything I wasn't. Fearless, spontaneous, with a near-religious devotion to outdoor adventure. Where I saw danger, he saw opportunity. While I meticulously planned each hike with trail maps and weather forecasts, he'd throw a sleeping bag in his truck and drive until he found somewhere interesting. Our friend group formed organically over those 4 years. Lisa came into the picture during sophomore year, when Ben quite literally ran into her while racing down the stairs in the library. She was his perfect match, equally adventurous but with a quiet intensity that balanced his boisterousness. Sarah was my study partner in environmental science, and we bonded over late-night cram sessions and shared anxiety about final projects. When she started dating Mike in our junior year, he joined our weekend excursions, though he never quite seemed to share our enthusiasm for the outdoors. After graduation, we all landed jobs in Seattle and our adventures became more sporadic. Weekend camping trips turned into monthly happy hours. Trail runs became coffee dates. Life was happening as it tends to do, pulling us slowly but surely into the gravity of adulthood. That's why when Ben called about his family's cabin in northern Idaho, it felt like a lifeline. "It's perfect," he said, his voice crackling with excitement over the phone. "No cell service, no Wi-Fi, just us in the woods. Like old times." I could hear the grin in his voice. "Plus, it's free. My parents haven't been up there in years, but the place is still standing." I should have asked more questions. Should have wondered why his parents had abandoned a perfectly good cabin in the woods. Should have noticed the slight hesitation in his voice when I asked about the last time he'd been there. But I didn't. Because Ben had never steered us wrong before, and because part of me desperately wanted to recapture that feeling of possibility that seemed to fade a little more with each passing year. So I said yes. We all did. 5 friends, 1 cabin, 2 nights in the woods. It seemed like the perfect escape. When I think back now, I try to remember if there were signs, warning flags I should have seen, but the truth is, everything seemed normal right up until it wasn't. The only thing that sticks out in my memory is what Sarah said to me the night before we left. We were having our usual Thursday coffee, and she seemed distracted, playing with her cup sleeve. "Do you ever get the feeling," she said, not quite meeting my eyes, "that some places don't want to be found?" I laughed it off then, told her she was being dramatic. But now, years later, those words haunt me, because she was right. Some places don't want to be found, and some places, once they find you, never let you go. The week leading up to the trip was a flurry of preparation, though looking back, we prepared for all the wrong things. Ben shared an old topographical map he'd found in his parents' garage, the paper yellowed and creased with handwritten notes in the margins I couldn't quite make out. The cabin was marked with a small X about 15 miles from the nearest town of Miller's Fork. I threw myself into research, reading about the local wildlife, mostly black bears and mountain lions, nothing too concerning, and the history of the area. Miller's Fork had been a logging town in the early 1900s, but now it was barely a dot on the map, population hovering around 200. The Forest Service maintained some trails in the region, but where we were going was off the grid. Our equipment list grew longer each day. I bought a new hiking backpack, emergency flares, and enough trail mix to feed a small army. Lisa, ever practical, focused on first aid supplies. Sarah borrowed a high-end camera from work, talking about documenting the trip. Mike seemed less enthusiastic, but he contributed a set of walkie-talkies, just in case. The night before we left, I had trouble sleeping. Not from fear, at least I don't think it was fear, but from a strange sort of anticipation. I kept thinking about that map, about those handwritten notes I couldn't read, about how Ben's voice had wavered just slightly when he talked about the cabin. I did one final equipment check at midnight, laying everything out on my living room floor. Hiking boots, broken in but still sturdy, topographical maps and compass, first aid kit with extra supplies, 3 days' worth of food and water, emergency shelter and sleeping bag, flashlights and extra batteries, matches in waterproof containers, multi-tool and hunting knife, everything a prepared hiker could need. Everything except protection from what was actually waiting for us. We left Seattle early Friday morning, the September sun still hiding behind the Cascades. Ben's old Ford Bronco was packed to the ceiling, our gear tetraset into every available space. The drive east was beautiful in that melancholic way that early fall can be, the trees just starting to turn, patches of yellow and red breaking up the endless green. The transformation was gradual. First the highways gave way to state roads, then to county roads, then to something that barely qualified as a road at all. The trees grew taller, closer together, their branches reaching over the narrow dirt track like grasping fingers. The GPS lost signal somewhere past Miller's Fork, but Ben seemed confident, taking turns without hesitation. "It's like muscle memory," he said, though I noticed his knuckles were white on the steering wheel. "Used to come up here every summer as a kid." The cabin appeared suddenly like a magic trick. One moment we were surrounded by dense forest, the next we were in a small clearing. The building squatted there, a dark shape against the darkening sky, its windows like empty eyes. It was bigger than I'd imagined. 2 stories of weathered wood and rusty metal, with a steep pitched roof and a stone chimney that listed slightly to one side. I remember the silence when we stepped out of the car. Not the peaceful quiet of nature, but something deeper, more absolute. No birdsong, no rustle of leaves, just the sound of our own breathing and the settling of the Bronco's engine. "Home sweet home," Ben said, but his laugh seemed forced. Inside, the cabin smelled of dust and decay and something else, something metallic that made my nose twitch. The main room was large, with a stone fireplace and heavy wooden furniture draped in sheets. Stairs led up to a second floor that was lost in shadows. We spent that first afternoon settling in, sweeping away cobwebs, airing out rooms, trying to make the place feel less abandoned. But there was something off about it all. The way the floorboards creaked under our feet, always a beat after we'd stepped. The way the windows seemed to darken too quickly as the sun set. The way the shadows moved when we weren't looking directly at them. Sarah was the first to say something. We were in the kitchen unpacking supplies when she grabbed my arm. "Listen," she whispered. I did, but I heard nothing. "That's just it," she said. "It's too quiet. Where are all the animals?" She was right. In all my years of hiking, I'd never experienced silence like this. But before I could respond, Ben called us into the main room. He'd gotten a fire going, and the warmth pushed back the shadows, created a circle of light that felt almost safe. Almost. That first night set the tone for everything that followed. We tried to keep things normal, drinking beers around the fire, telling stories, pretending we couldn't feel the weight of the darkness pressing in around us. But there were moments when the conversation would die suddenly, and we'd all find ourselves listening to something that wasn't there. The trouble really started the next morning. Ben wanted to show us some old hiking trails he remembered from his childhood, paths that weren't on any map but supposedly led to amazing views. We packed light, just water, snacks, and basic safety gear. The morning was crisp, autumn cold, our breath forming clouds in the air. The trail Ben chose started behind the cabin, barely visible through years of overgrowth. As we walked, I noticed something odd about the vegetation. The trees seemed to grow at strange angles, their trunks twisted and gnarled in ways that didn't look natural. And there were these patches where nothing grew at all, perfect circles of bare earth that felt cold to the touch. About 2 miles in, Sarah found the first marker. It was carved into a tree trunk at eye level, a simple symbol that looked like a stick figure but with too many limbs. The cuts were fresh, the wood still light against the dark bark. "That wasn't here when I was a kid," Ben said, his voice uncertain. "Must be some new trail markers." But even as he said it, we knew he was wrong. This wasn't any trail marker I'd ever seen, and I'd been hiking these mountains for years. There was something deliberate about it, something that made my skin crawl. We found more symbols as we walked deeper into the forest. They got more complex, more disturbing. Some looked like letters from an alphabet I'd never seen. Others like drawings of things that couldn't exist. And they were all fresh, all newly carved. Then we found the clearing. It was perfectly circular, maybe 30 feet across and completely dead. Not just empty like the patches we'd seen before, but dead. The ground was black like it had been burned, and the trees around the edge were twisted away from the center, their branches reaching outward like they were trying to escape. In the middle of the clearing was a pile of bones. They weren't animal bones. They were too big, too straight. But they weren't quite human either. They'd been arranged in a pattern, like some kind of grotesque artwork. And they were clean, impossibly clean, like they'd been bleached by the sun, except there was no sun here. No light penetrated the canopy above this clearing. Mike was the first to step forward, drawn by some morbid curiosity. "This has to be some kind of joke," he said, reaching for one of the bones. "Don't touch it." Lisa's voice was sharp, panicked. But it was too late. The moment Mike's fingers brushed the bone, something changed. The air got thicker, heavier, like we were underwater. And the silence, that unnatural silence that had been following us since we arrived, suddenly broke. It started as a low hum, just at the edge of hearing. Then it grew, becoming a vibration we could feel in our teeth, in our bones. The pile of bones began to tremble, small pieces clicking together like horrible wind chimes. And then we heard the scream. It came from everywhere and nowhere, a sound that shouldn't have been possible for any living thing to make, high and low at the same time, like multiple voices layered together in perfect discord. It went on, building in intensity until I thought my head would explode. When it finally stopped, we ran. We ran like children, crashing through the underbrush, tripping over roots, our only thought to get away from that clearing. But in our panic, we lost the trail. The forest that had seemed merely creepy before now felt actively malevolent. The trees seemed to move when we weren't looking directly at them. The shadows grew deeper, and that humming sound followed us, always just quiet enough to make us doubt whether we were really hearing it. We ran for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, until we finally stopped, gasping for breath. None of us wanted to admit we were lost, but it was obvious. The forest looked different now, denser, darker, more primeval. The trees here were ancient, their trunks wider than cars, their branches forming a canopy so thick that only occasional shafts of light reached the forest floor. "We need to get back to the cabin," Sarah said, her voice shaking. "Ben, which way?" But Ben just stood there staring at something in the distance. His face had gone pale and his hands were trembling. "This isn't right," he whispered. "These trees, they weren't here before. None of this was here." That's when we noticed the carvings. They covered the trees around us, hundreds of symbols, some familiar from the trail, others new and more complex. They seemed to move in the corner of your eye, shifting and changing when you weren't looking directly at them. And they were bleeding. Dark liquid oozed from the fresh cuts, too dark to be sap, too thick to be water. It ran down the trunks in rivulets, pooling at the bases of the trees. The smell was overwhelming, metallic and organic like copper and rot. Lisa started crying, quiet, desperate sobs that seemed to echo in the unnatural silence. Mike put his arm around her, but I could see he was shaking too. We all were. "We need to move," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Standing still isn't safe." "But which way?" Every direction looked the same, endless trees, endless symbols, endless darkness. Ben had always been our navigator, but now he seemed lost in more ways than one, his eyes distant, unfocused. That's when we heard it again, that impossible scream. Closer this time, and now we could hear something else beneath it. The sound of movement, of something large moving through the underbrush, something that wasn't trying to be quiet anymore. The thing that came for us moved like smoke between the trees, a darkness deeper than the shadows around it. At first we only caught glimpses, a shape here, a movement there, always at the edge of vision. But each time we saw it, it was closer and more defined. I remember the moment I first saw it clearly. The memory is burned into my mind like a brand. It stood upright, towering over us, easily 9 or 10 feet tall. Its limbs were too long, too thin, joints bending in impossible ways. The skin, if you could call it that, was a pale, sickly gray, stretched too tight over a frame that seemed to be constantly shifting and changing. But it was the face that haunted my nightmares for years after. It wasn't a face at all, but rather a suggestion of one, like a child's drawing done in negative space. Where eyes should have been, there were only deep hollows that seemed to swallow light. Its mouth was a jagged tear that opened far too wide, revealing row upon row of needle-sharp teeth. The stench hit us then, the smell of decay and rotting meat, so strong it made my eyes water. Sarah retched beside me, and the sound seemed to draw the creature's attention. Its head snapped toward us with a motion too quick, too jerky to be natural. Then it smiled. "Run!" Ben's voice cracked with terror, but we were already moving, crashing through the underbrush like panicked animals. I could hear it behind us, moving with a terrible grace, branches snapping and that awful humming sound growing louder. Lisa fell first. Her foot caught on a root and she went down hard. Mike stopped to help her, and that's when the creature struck. It moved like lightning, impossibly fast. One moment it was behind us, the next it was there, looming over them. Mike pushed Lisa away, screaming at her to run, and turned to face it. I'll never forget the sound he made when it took him. Not a scream. Screams are human. This was something else, something primal and broken. The creature's arms, now more like tentacles, wrapped around him, and for a moment he was suspended in the air, silhouetted against the darkness. Then he was gone, pulled into the shadows between the trees. We kept running. What else could we do? The forest seemed to be working against us, branches whipping at our faces, roots rising up to trip us, the ground itself becoming treacherous and uneven. The symbols on the trees were glowing now, casting an eerie blue light that made everything look alien and wrong. Sarah was next. 1 minute she was beside me, panting and sobbing. The next she was yanked backward into the darkness. I heard her call my name once, then nothing. The silence that followed was worse than any scream. Ben grabbed my hand, pulling me forward. "The cabin," he gasped. "We have to make it to the cabin." But his voice was different now, hollow, like he was speaking from very far away. When I looked at him, his face seemed to shift and blur like I was seeing it underwater. Lisa was somewhere behind us, her footsteps getting fainter. I wanted to stop, to wait for her, but Ben's grip on my hand was iron tight. "Don't look back," he kept saying. "Whatever you do, don't look back." But I did look back. Of course I did. And I saw it. The creature had Lisa. It was holding her up like a puppet, its 2 long fingers wrapped around her throat. And as I watched, horrified, it began to change. Its form rippled and flowed like smoke in the wind, taking on a new shape, Lisa's shape. A perfect copy, down to the smallest detail except for the eyes. The eyes remained those bottomless pits of darkness. Then it dropped the real Lisa, her body crumpling to the ground like a discarded toy, and turned those terrible eyes toward me. Ben was still pulling me forward. But his hand felt wrong now, cold and somehow fluid. I looked at him, really looked at him, and realized with dawning horror that he wasn't Ben anymore. Maybe he hadn't been Ben for a while. I jerked my hand away and started running in a new direction. Any direction. Just away from whatever was wearing my friend's face. The forest blurred around me, the glowing symbols pulsing like heartbeats, the humming sound building to a deafening roar. Behind me, I heard Ben's voice, but it wasn't Ben's voice anymore. It was older than time, deeper than the earth, and it was laughing. "You can't run from us," it said, the words somehow forming in my mind rather than my ears. "We are the forest. We are the darkness between the trees. We are the hunger that never ends." And then they were all around me. Ben, Lisa, Sarah, Mike, but wrong, twisted, their faces melting and reforming, their bodies shifting like smoke. They moved in perfect unison, reaching for me with 2 long fingers, their mouths opening to reveal those endless rows of teeth. I closed my eyes and screamed. I don't remember exactly how I escaped. The memories are fragmented, like shards of a broken mirror, each piece reflecting something too terrible to look at directly. I remember running until my lungs burned and my legs gave out. I remember falling, crawling, dragging myself through the underbrush while that awful laughter echoed through the trees. The sky was starting to lighten when I finally broke through the tree line onto a road. Not the dirt track we'd driven in on, but a proper paved highway. A trucker found me there, huddled in the pre-dawn darkness, covered in dirt and blood, most of it my own. He said I was speaking in tongues, repeating words that didn't make sense, drawing symbols in the dirt with shaking fingers. The hospital kept me for a week. Physical injuries, multiple lacerations, mild concussion, severe dehydration, and exhaustion. But it was the psychological evaluation that kept me there. How do you explain to a psychiatrist that your friends were taken by something that could wear their faces? That the forest itself had turned against you? That symbols carved into trees had bled? The police searched, of course. They found Ben's Bronco exactly where we'd left it, but there was no cabin. Just more forest, endless trees stretching in every direction. They found no bodies, no evidence of violence, no sign that anyone had been there at all. The official report listed my friends as missing persons, probably lost in the wilderness. They suggested that I had hallucinated most of it, a combination of panic, dehydration, and exposure. Maybe they were right. Sometimes I almost convinced myself of that. The nightmares started almost immediately. Not the usual kind that fade with morning light, but vivid terrors that felt more like memories. I would see them, Ben, Lisa, Sarah, Mike, standing at the foot of my bed, their faces shifting and changing, those bottomless black eyes staring into mine. I would wake up screaming, my sheets soaked with sweat, the taste of copper in my mouth. I couldn't stay in Seattle. Too many memories, too many concerned looks from people who knew them. Who knew us? I moved to Arizona, as far from forests as I could get. The desert felt safer somehow. No trees to hide behind, no shadows that moved when you weren't looking. But distance didn't help. The dreams followed me. And worse than the dreams were the moments of déjà vu. Catching glimpses of familiar faces in crowds, hearing their voices in random conversations. Once I saw Ben across a busy street. He looked exactly as he had that day, right down to the red flannel shirt he'd been wearing. When he smiled at me, his teeth were wrong, too many, too sharp. I blinked and he was gone. The symbols started appearing too. I would find them scratched into my bathroom mirror, carved into my bedroom door, drawn in condensation on my windows. Always the same ones from the forest, always fresh, always when I was alone. Sometimes they would bleed, that same dark liquid dripping down the walls. But when I tried to show someone, they would be gone. 3 years after it happened, I got a letter from Sarah's parents. They'd received a postcard, they said, postmarked from a small town in northern Idaho. It was in Sarah's handwriting, but the message made no sense. Just those symbols drawn in what looked like red ink, covering every available space. A month later, Lisa's sister called me. Lisa had appeared in the background of a family photo taken at her niece's birthday party. Just standing there watching, her face a blur in the image. When they looked again, the photo had changed. Lisa was gone, but there were symbols scratched into the wall behind where she had been. I started researching, digging into the history of that area. The town of Miller's Fork had other stories, it turned out. Every few decades, people would go missing in those woods. Sometimes in groups, sometimes alone. Some were found later, changed in ways their families couldn't explain. Most were never found at all. Ben's family moved away shortly after it happened, but I managed to track down his father. He was in a nursing home in Florida. His mind mostly gone, but he had moments of clarity. In one of them, he told me about his own experience in those woods back when he was young. About finding the cabin, about the symbols, about the things that wore his friends' faces. They're still waiting, he said, his eyes suddenly clear and focused. They're patient. They have all the time in the world. It's been 10 years now. I'm back in Seattle, though I don't know why. Maybe because running didn't help. Maybe because I'm tired of being afraid. Maybe because part of me needs to understand. I've learned to live with it mostly. The nightmares come less frequently now. The symbols appear only rarely, usually when I'm most vulnerable, late at night when I'm alone, when I start to doubt my own memories. I've learned to avoid mirrors at night, to not look too closely at faces in crowds, to ignore the sound of familiar laughter carried on the wind. But sometimes, on cold autumn nights when the wind moves through the trees just right, I hear that humming sound again. And sometimes when I'm driving past the mountains, I catch glimpses of something moving between the trees, something tall and thin, with too many limbs and a face that isn't a face at all. I don't go hiking anymore. I don't go into the woods. But sometimes the woods come to me, in dreams, in memories, in reflections caught in darkened windows. And always, always they're waiting. Because that's the thing about places that don't want to be found. Sometimes they find you instead. And once they do, they never really let you go. I know they're still out there, wearing my friends' faces, moving through the darkness between the trees, waiting, patient, hungry. And sometimes, in my darkest moments, I wonder if I really escaped at all. If this life I'm living now is real, or if I'm still there in that forest, trapped in an endless loop while something else wears my face, lives my life, writes my story. I guess I'll never know for sure. But if you're reading this and you find yourself driving through northern Idaho, stay on the main roads. Don't look too closely at the trees. And if you see a cabin in the woods that wasn't there before, keep driving. Keep driving and don't look back. Because they're always watching, always waiting, and they have all the time in the world. This is an email from one of my friends. We'll call her Abigail. I received this back after sending her an email asking if she wanted to go up to my family's cabin for a week this past summer. Here goes. James, I'm really sorry. I know I promised. This year would be the one that I finally went with you to the cabin. You've told me again and again that it'll be safe. There are other people there, but I just don't feel up to it. Next year, maybe, if we're all together. We could go to my parents' place even. Maybe go skiing. Colorado has some nice mountains. Who am I kidding? I guess if I'm going to blow you off for the third year in a row, you might as well know. Do you remember 4 years ago? You probably don't. Well, you asked me the same question. But my parents had already planned on going up to the cabin that year since my dad was finally off of work. Anyway, I went up there with them. It was good. Fun, I guess. At least I got to spend time with them. I'm rambling again, sorry. The point is, I've not been honest with you. Or with anyone, for that matter. One night when my parents were all asleep, I went out into the woods on one of the trails. You know the system that runs back behind my parents' cabin, don't you? Well, I kinda got lost. It wasn't the smartest move, but you know how my insomnia is. I just felt claustrophobic, cooped up in that cabin. Well, I was lost thoroughly. There was no signal up in Colorado where my parents was, so I had no idea what to do. I just kept walking down the trail. I guess I hoped that it was one of the routes that led down to the town, and not one of the ways to the backside of the mountain. I walked for half an hour at least, and I didn't get anywhere. Most of it was uphill, and the trail kept getting rockier. I think that's why I decided to turn around and take a different route when I reached one of the small ponds. You know, you can never be quite sure with those ponds. They all look the same. As I was turning around, I caught a glimpse of some light through the trees. A yellow kind of light, like you would see from a lamp, not the glaring white ones that they line the water towers with, though I guess a water tower would have helped too. I walked over to it, thinking I could ask for some help. And as I entered the small clearing with the house, it was a small house with an oak wood frame, I saw the lights were on, and the door was open. But there wasn't anyone there, if you can believe it. I figured that whoever owned the cabin just went out into the forest for a minute. They would probably be back soon. I don't know why I decided to wait inside the cabin instead of outside. But can you blame me? It gets really cold at night in Colorado. I walked into the house. A rich person definitely owned it. It had all the bells and whistles, a nice stove, refrigerator, the biggest flat screen I'd ever seen. I sat down on the couch. I don't think I even waited 2 minutes before a young man walked back in. He was wearing casual clothes, a blue hoodie if I remember correctly, and jeans. He looked surprised to see me there. I asked him if he knew the way back to town, or if he could at least help me get back to my parents' cabin. He ignored my question, at first the nerve, and said, "Darling, you look cold. Let me get you a drink and a blanket first." Now, there was something seriously off about the dude. I can't quite place my finger on it, but it was something about the way he walked and moved his arms. It just looked jerky and weird, and his face looked fine. I guess except it was too long and too smooth, and he would never look me in the eyes. He got back with the tea and a map, which I thought was the sweetest thing. He said he would be in the other room to get a blanket for me. And then he just, well, stood there watching me. It was really creepy. I didn't trust the tea then. I was in the middle of the forest at some stranger's house, and a funky-looking stranger on top of that. I was seriously freaked out, and I began to think, he's not going to leave until I drink some tea, is he? So I planned on drinking it, and then getting the heck out of there. I took one sip, and it tasted bitter as heck. But he was already walking away, seemingly satisfied. I don't remember much after that, but I do remember trying to stand and run. I don't even think I made it to the door, before I collapsed. This part's where it gets weirder. I woke up in his cabin sometime later. It was dark inside, and I had to kind of fumble my way around until I found the coffee table. It was dark, pitch black, but I could still see a bit somehow. I really don't know how to describe this to you, but I think it was coming through the windows. The wall by the windows was just lighter than the rest of the room, but it was even darker outside than it was inside. I went up to the window and pressed my hand against the glass. The glass was hot, hot like the sidewalk during the summer. I thought I'd burned myself, but it didn't hurt and it didn't even feel warm. It's hard to explain, but I could just tell it was hot. Then I heard someone scream behind me. It was this little girl. She looked like she was only 11. I think that was when I realized that there was something seriously wrong here. There were 8 of us in the cabin. It took the rest of them about an hour to wake up, and when they did, it was silent. Nobody wanted to talk. I think all of us, being strangers in an even stranger cabin, we were all just confused at first. I decided there was no use in just standing around. So I got up and I told them I was going to do some exploring. It was definitely the same cabin, but something was off. Save for the living room and kitchen, all the other doors were missing. There weren't any lights either. I was looking around in the kitchen drawers, I think. And another weird thing was there wasn't anything in them. That's when I heard the door slam open. I turned around, surprised, expecting to see the strange man come in, but it was one of the men I'd awakened with. He was just standing there in front of the open door. There was some kind of black goop behind it, but it appeared like it was swimming almost, but it wasn't making waves. It looked like it was folding in on itself, and every time it did, I caught a glint of light. It was like a soft blue, but it wasn't any color I can describe, at least not any color I've seen before. He just stood there staring into the goop. He kept inching towards it like he wanted to jump in it, but something was holding him back. Joey, one of the girls, Michelle I think her name was, said to him, "What are you doing?" The man didn't respond. He didn't even look at her. He just kept inching towards the door. Then the goop stretched, or more like it bulged, and part of it caught around the waist of the man. He looked at the girl for a second like he had broken out of a spell. He looked terrified, but the goop just yanked him into itself with a hiss like water hitting a burning hot pan. The younger girl began to scream. Awful an 11-year-old scream is. Anyway, I slammed the door shut and pulled the girl down onto the floor with the others. "What was that?" Michelle asked. "Where did he go?" I was dumbfounded. I think we all were. And terrified. We started discussing what we saw, how that man had been absorbed or dissolved into the goop. I kept glancing back at the door, expecting to see Joey burst through it at any moment. One of the girls pulled out her phone and tried to call the police, but again, there was no signal. Another one of the girls got up and moved around, trying to find a landline. I stayed on the ground with the little girl and a few of the other people. There was something weird about Michelle. She hadn't looked at any of us once the entire time we'd been talking. She just kept staring out the window. Curious, I started to look too. I don't think the goop was actually moving, but it appeared to be pulsing or breathing. It was pressing up against the windows and then back and up against the windows again. Michelle rose to her feet and started to the door, and somehow that broke me out of my trance. I caught her sleeve as she passed. I was confused about how she could even go over there after what had happened to the boy. "Where are you going?" I asked. Then she hit me. I let her go then. All I could do was watch as she opened the door, and that mass stretched to take her too. We waited for hours. I don't remember how any of us were left at that point. It was alluring. I felt drawn to it. I don't know why, but I had the urge to just stare at it, to let it swallow me up too. I think we all felt it. At one point, I was holding the little girl and I caught her staring out the window at the blackness. I didn't know what to do, so I tried to cover her eyes. She started to scream and kick at me, asking me why I wouldn't let her look. Somehow she got my hand in her mouth and bit down hard. I think I remember she drew blood, but it just kind of floated there in the air like the videos of astronauts drinking orange juice on the International Space Station. She was already on her way to the door, running, and I ran after her. I don't know what would have happened if I hadn't made it to her in time. I had her pinned against the wall and she was kicking and screaming, and someone else, one of the others, just walked by and opened the door and the goop took them. The little girl and I just stared in shock. It felt as if a wave of heat pushed against us when the girl at the door sizzled out of existence, like someone had pointed a stream of hot air towards us. I dragged the little girl back into the center of the room and we sat again, waiting. I don't know what for. I just knew that doing anything else could kill any of us. Nothing happened for hours. I must have been in the cabin for days, though. I never got hungry or thirsty, and I never had to use the bathroom. We tried to play games to pass the time, but you can only play Go Fish so many times. The cabin had practically nothing in it now. Furniture, sure, but no books or games. The fridge was empty and the TV was not on the wall anymore. I tried tying myself to the furniture with my shoelaces. I thought that if I did get the urge to go to the door, it would stop me. So I attached my hand to one leg of the couch. Everyone was in some sort of daze. We all moved around sluggishly, like we were walking in a pool or through molasses. It started getting harder to tell who was where, how long it had been, or what I'd been doing. I started to forget things too, like what day it was and why I was even there. James, I started to forget my own name. I was even more afraid when that began to happen. I just kept repeating my own name under my breath over and over again for hours. I must have looked like a lunatic. I think I was at that point. The other people were picked off one by one, all of them being absorbed into that goop until there were only 3 of us left. By then I was staring into the windows as well. It was beautiful, James, like heaven is supposed to look. Somehow the black was colorful. I just wanted to stare at it, to become one with it. I nearly didn't notice when the last girl walked over to me and yanked the little girl from my arms. It was so sudden I didn't even know what to do. I got up and I tried to grab her arm, asking her what she was doing, but she pushed me back. I fell and hit my head on the side of the coffee table, and that's the last I remember. When I woke up, it was daytime. I remember I was still tied to the couch and the door was wide open, like it had been when I first entered that place. But now I was the only person inside. All 7 of the others were gone, as if they had vanished into thin air. I untied myself from the couch and I began to make my way over to the door. When I saw something, James, you're not going to believe me when I say this, but there were deep impressions on the floor behind the couch. That girl, the last one, she had tried to drag me and the couch into the door with her, and that poor little girl. I didn't know what else to do, so I ran. I ran as fast as I could all the way back to my family's cabin. I didn't come out of the cabin for the rest of the trip. I haven't been back since. Now I hope you understand why I won't go with you. Again, I'm really sorry, but I just can't. I hope that you'll be safe too. Have fun. And James, don't go getting lost, especially. The hunting cabin was just as I remembered it. It was tiny, hardly bigger than a tool shed, and after a year of neglect, dust now coated every surface. I hadn't been there in almost 10 years, not since the last time I went hunting with my grandfather Sebastian. I'd been so terrified by the thing we saw in the woods there that I hadn't wanted to return, and my parents just assumed I was too bored to want to spend 2 weeks with a boring old man. But Grab still came to visit us. Thankfully, we never went there. When Gramps passed away a year ago, he left the cabin and the 30 acres surrounding it to his only remaining grandchild. At 20 years old, I had never expected to set foot on the rural mountainside again, much less inherit it. But a bad breakup had left me with the decision of moving into the cabin or into my parents' basement. The choice had almost been hard to make. The local newspaper, the Village Times, had claimed that Gramps died of a bear attack while out chopping firewood behind his cabin. I didn't really buy that story, though, and even as I pulled my beat-up old Ford into the unpaved driveway, I had my hand on my rifle, though if that thing came back, I was sure it wouldn't do much to it. But still, it made me feel better. I hadn't seen it in a decade, but if that creature was still out there, I would be prepared this time, at least I hoped. Several hours later, I was unpacked and the cabin was decently clean. All of the utilities were still hooked up and the refrigerator was well stocked. I had taken the week off of work to adjust to my new life. I was planning on just relaxing for the next few days. My first night and day passed uneventfully, but by the second night things were getting a little weird. I had spent enough time in the country as a child to be familiar with the wildlife here. Raccoons, skunks, bears, other mammals. But the freshly made claw marks on the side of the cabin, they weren't anything that I recognized. I woke up on my 3rd morning to gouges in the wood, and I was definitely unnerved. They were too large to belong to any small critters, and far too high up to be from coyotes. They were even too wide to be a mountain lion or bear. In this neck of the woods, that ruled out everything logical. As I studied the claw marks, I wondered how I could have slept through them being made. They definitely hadn't been there when I first arrived, and the fresh marks stood out in a bright contrast to the weathered wood of the cabin walls. I supposed a human could have made them with a knife, but I didn't have neighbors for miles. Who would be skulking around out here just to prank me like this? It didn't make any sense. It crossed my mind that maybe my ex might have done it just to freak me out. But Sandra lived almost 50 miles away and did not have the address for the cabin in the first place. I don't use social media enough to bother listing my new address, and we didn't have friends in common or anything like that. I eventually shrugged it off, deciding to let it go. I knew that worrying about it wouldn't that afternoon, though. I found myself driving the 10 miles into town and buying some motion-activated floodlights and a motion-sensing camera. 2 more nights passed, and each morning, I woke up to the claw marks getting closer and closer to the cabin door. As much as I wanted to believe it was a prank, I had to admit to myself that the evidence was overwhelmingly against that idea. The floodlights would turn on and the camera would snap. Yet somehow all I would ever see in the photos was an empty yard. I had even tried to set up a video on my phone, but all it managed to capture was a vague blur of movement at the edge of the screen. I had enough. On the 5th night, I went outside, rifle in hand, settling comfortably on the porch steps. There was no noise, no sound to indicate that the usual nocturnal critters were up and about. I shut all the lights off and waited for the creature that I knew would come. Hours passed, and as 1 a.m. rolled around, I snapped myself out of a doze. I could hear something moving quietly out by the edge of the woods, where I could make out a figure skulking about, its features hidden in the shadows. As the animal drew closer, I rubbed my eyes in disbelief, because there stood Sebastian, my supposedly dead grandpa. He wasn't wearing any clothes. He paused mid-step, his head slowly turning to face me, probably hearing me gasp from shock. Grandpa looked sickly, with skin pale and ribs visible. He was bald now, has one scenty-like beard and hair gone. "Grandpa," I called out. I could hear the quiver in my own voice, and my hands were shaking from terror. The rifle had fallen to my lap, nearly forgotten in the intensity of seeing my presumably dead grandfather. I'd been so convinced that what I was about to see would be that antlered creature that I saw years ago, the one I knew killed Sebastian. But I never considered once that my grandpa was still alive. "Grandpa, what are you doing? Come inside." Tears were streaming down my cheeks. I didn't care what my grandfather had been doing this whole time or why he was out there. All I cared about was that he was still alive. I wanted to hug him again. "You stupid boy." His voice barely sounded human anymore. His voice came out all wrong, and before I could respond, Grandpa was bounding into the woods on all fours. He was gone in the blink of an eye, the bushes hardly swaying where he had passed through. The woods remained as eerily silent as they had been before, even though my grandfather's retreat should have made a large amount of noise. Not a second later, a low growl came from behind me, the sound reverberating off the cabin walls. A massive creature, the one that I remembered, approached from the side of the cabin. Within seconds, it became clear to me that it wasn't a human or an animal, unless someone was wearing an amazing and terrifying costume. The creature was every bit as surreal as I remembered. Long, pale limbs sprouted from an emaciated torso. An ivory deer skull shined in what little moonlight managed to bleed out through the clouds. It was wearing ragged old buckskin leggings and had beads around its neck. I could not see its eyes, though, but I knew without a doubt that if it had any, it was staring directly at me. I knew not whether it was a Wendigo or a skinwalker or something else, but it didn't matter. It was here. Before I could take in any more detail, the creature began to laugh, a guttural sound that echoed in my head hauntingly. It was laughing so hard at me that it nearly doubled over. I realized that its limbs were able to wrap around its body almost twice. I raised my rifle, firing several times at it point blank, all of those rounds lodging firmly into the creature's neck and torso. The being looked down at its new piercings. Then, without a problem, almost comfortably, it began to dig out the bullets at an unhurried pace. It dropped them onto the ground like a child plucking flower petals, and it seemed to sigh in irritation as it dug out the final one. It just spoke. What was going on? What did this thing want? Did Grandpa always know about this horrendous-looking thing? My head began to ache with the strain of trying to understand all this. It seemed as though it was annoyed by the bullets. It then lifted its claw and pointed it at the cabin. "Go." I was all I could get out in reply to this thing speaking to me. I blinked profusely, and the next thing I knew, the monster was gone, and standing there was Rufus, my grandpa Sebastian's best friend. Rufus had been around as long as I could remember and had always been a kind old man. He supposedly lived on the other side of the mountain, even though I'd never actually seen his house, let alone been to it. Rufus just always sort of appeared out of nowhere, often startling us so badly that we had almost shot him a few times. "What in tarnation you doing out here, whippersnapper? Am I dreaming?" "No, you're not dreaming, but you need to get inside before that thing comes back. That thing that looks like your grandbaby." I was shaking so tremendously from fear that I could barely move my limbs at the time, but I managed to navigate the steps. I'm not entirely sure why I obeyed Rufus after seeing that thing, but after seeing Rufus's familiar face, there was something calming about it, making this insane situation more easily